Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. Sap, I know what we're going to talk about today. We're going to break down the Celtics Summer League play so far, 2 games in, and they are looking good, Sap. Game winner last night. So, I'm assuming you just want to do 40 minutes on Matt Ryan, Sam Hauser, and the rest of the Celtics Summer League team.
Absolutely. The Matt Ryan that got traded from the Atlanta Falcons to the Indianapolis Colts. That Matt Ryan who started BC a decade and a half ago.
Yep, he's playing basketball now for the Celtics
Now he's
Summer League
taking
team.
up basketball. I was not aware that he was that good an athlete.
He's Sap, he's a 3-point shooter. You didn't know that?
He banked in the game winner, right?
He did. Just like, much more clutch than other Matt Ryan was in the Super Bowl that he lost.
Very true.
So there you go. But yeah, no, we're not going to talk about the Celtics Summer League as much as I would like to, Sap. We're going to talk about all the things that have been happening so far in the NBA offseason, excluding Summer League play. Unless, Sap, you wanted to talk about your new basketball crutch, Paolo Banchero, for the Orlando Magic, dominating so much so that they shut him down in 2 games. You're free to talk about him if you'd like to.
Sure. And then you've got Danilo Gallinari coming to the Celtics. So the Italians are going to be taking over the NBA next season. And
everything's coming up Italy.
Absolutely. Except they didn't qualify for the World Cup here in 2022, which is still mystifying to me. It's the second time in a row they've not qualified. They didn't qualify back in 2018 either. And Banchero, I think, is going to be an outstanding NBA player. He's already got an NBA body, right? 6'10", 250. He was so good in the first 2 games that they said, well, sit down. We know you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, he certainly looks like the worthy number 1 overall pick. We've seen a little bit of Chet Holmgren too, who was the number 2 pick. You saw the good and the bad in game 1. He dominated with his unicorn skill, right? Like, he's hitting threes, playing well in the post, blocking a ton of shots. I think he had 6 blocks in his opening game. And then in game 2, he was sort of physically bodied by Kenny Lofton Jr., who is not related to the Kenny Lofton baseball player, Sap, which I did not know. And so you saw the good and the bad of Chet Holmgren.
Yeah, he's got a lot of room to grow, no pun intended. 194 pounds at 7'1". I mean,
he's
Kevin
not
Durant
194 pounds.
Well, at 7'1", it'd be difficult not to be at least 194 pounds. But he makes Kevin Durant look like Karl Malone. He is just so skinny. But he's very skilled, so I think he's a long-term project, although he's a little bit older than the rest of this class. He's already 20, so, he's like a year older than Banchero and some of the other top players that were drafted. But I think he's still going to have to mature physically. But, again, we'll see what happens with Oklahoma City. He's a very unique player, without question, right? A guy that size who can handle the ball, shoot threes, block shots. But, when you're going up against guys that are 60, 70 pounds heavier and stronger than you, it's going to be difficult. They're going to have to find a way to put some weight on them. I have ideas how to do that. Maybe I can help.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what the cuisine is like in Oklahoma City, Sap. If he was playing in New Orleans, as we've seen with Zion, you can put weight on quick playing there with the restaurants there. In Oklahoma City, I'm not sure what they got for restaurants.
Yeah, him and Zion would be like the number 10.
Yeah, basically. Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Twins with Schwarzenegger and DeVito.
Very much so. But anyways, yeah, we just a quick aside on some of the rookies that we've seen in Summer League. But mostly, Sap, what's going on the NBA is still a holding pattern with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. We're waiting to see when or if they get traded. It seemed like the Kyrie to the Lakers thing was inevitable, but it now seems like it's hit a little bit of a snag in that the Nets wisely are saying, well, we're not just going to take back what Russell Westbrook. You have to give us something of value because Russell Westbrook's contract is a net negative. Do you still feel optimistic this gets done, Sap?
It doesn't seem like there's any other team interested in Kyrie Irving. So the Lakers do have an opportunity to make this happen. The problem is the contracts don't match up. So to make it work, actually, Brooklyn would have to send a veteran or two to LA along with Kyrie Irving to make the contracts work. But the way that the Lakers could even this thing out, obviously, would be with draft choices. But they don't have a lot of draft choices in the future. Do they want to give up 1 or 2 first-round picks, 3 years down the road? I think they're going to have to because LeBron has, 2 more years left probably, and he's not even committed to after this season. I mean, LeBron could play this season and then go somewhere else in 2023, 24. So if they're all in this year and try to cobble together a roster that can win a championship, they pretty much have to get Kyrie Irving to improve their chances. And whatever it takes, if it's going to take Russell Westbrook and draft picks, the Lakers are going to have to do it. But there's no market right now for Kyrie Irving, which, just shows you how much his stock has fallen because as a talent, we know how great he is, but people just don't want to deal with the headache. And it's a 1-year deal. And at the end of the year, what is Kyrie Irving going to do? What the hell is Kyrie Irving going to do in the middle of the season? No one knows.
I think there's a degree too with, the Nets obviously asking for more, which they should, because, like I said, Russell Westbrook's contract is in that negative. And also I think we know that the Nets and Kyrie's relationship is soured on each other. Hard to blame the Nets for that, though Kevin Durant seems to be doing that. I think there's a degree with the Nets ownership, and maybe Sean Marks, their GM too, of not wanting to just acquiesce to Kyrie. He wants to go to the Lakers. The Lakers want to go there, so just send him there. I don't think they want to just do what Kyrie wants. So I think that's kind of holding things up too, is that they're like, well, why are we, giving this guy exactly what he wants? He's basically screwed us and left us in a terrible position, and we're going to reward him. So I think that they're waiting to see if another team, can come up with a better offer, because the Lakers offer is obviously not that good. And also, since he is under contract for a year, I do feel like they don't feel necessarily a sense of urgency, because they don't want to just send him exactly where he wants to go, because they don't want to reward the guy.
Yeah. And at this point, I wouldn't say that the Nets are being stubborn. I think they have all the means in the world to stick to their guns. I mean, they committed to Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant 3 summers ago, and it just hasn't worked out. At that point, they're going to try to make, lemonade out of sour lemons, or chicken salad out of chicken shit, or whatever other, term you want to use, because that's where they're at right now. And I think Kyrie Irving is going to have to go first, and then they'll have to figure out what to do with Kevin Durant. But unless the Nets are just able to tell Kyrie Irving, look, we want you back for this year. Kevin Durant, we're not going to trade you. We've got Ben Simmons. If he's engaged, let's make a run at this and then deal with this next offseason. That could be one way they sell it, because what exactly they're going to get back for Kyrie Irving is going to be a bad contract, and Russell Westbrook, who that will expire at the end of the year. So you have that money to play with. But Brooklyn doesn't have any kind of draft picks that they can go ahead and tank. I mean, actually, the team that would love to see Brooklyn implode, the Houston Rockets, who own several of the Brooklyn Nets draft picks, first-round picks from the James Harden trade. They'd love to see the Nets blow this thing up and fall to the depths of the Eastern Conference, and then Houston could really, end up with several really good draft picks, a la, the way the Nets imploded nearly a decade ago after Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce retired. Those picks went to Boston and led the Celtics to drafting Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. That's the way you can kind of rebuild on the fly here. So there's a lot that can happen, but everything seems to be in a holding pattern, because it doesn't have to happen right away. It's not the NFL where you're trying to acquire a quarterback that you got to get in and he's got to learn the offense and got to work with the wide receivers. I mean, these guys can play together pretty much in any system. They're all that good.
Yeah, I think that's that certainly makes, sense. Like you said, it's not the NFL, but I'm starting, and maybe I'm crazy, Sap, starting to think that there's a real chance that the season begins with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving on the Nets. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, I could see that happening. Absolutely. I mean, if they can't get anywhere near the value for either, then why do it? Bring them back. I mean, we know Kevin Durant loves to play basketball. I think he'd be invested. I think he'd still go out there, give you a max effort.
He's not going to hold out. Yeah.
No, he loves basketball too much. With Kyrie Irving, who the hell knows? But maybe Kyrie Irving realizes, well, I've got to put together a really good season, show everyone that I'm committed, because he's got another contract that he can sign. He's still a young player, right? I mean, there's still a lot of years left for Kyrie Irving if he shows that he's invested, healthy, and, is focused on basketball. So that is a real possibility, because you're not just going to give away Kyrie Irving, and just certainly not going to give away Kevin Durant. And what do you get back in return? And they're talking about that they want at least one all-star, maybe a second-level all-star. And for teams to do that, then they're going to weaken themselves to get Kevin Durant. And it's going to be kind of an equal deal, right? I mean, look, if Phoenix has to send Devin Booker for Kevin Durant, does Phoenix really that much better? Yeah, probably, but not that much better, because Booker's a younger player who's, also first-team All-NBA, even though Durant didn't make it. We know what his level of talent is. But even the Celtics, I mean, Jason Tatum, people are floating out the idea of Tatum for Durant. Tatum right now is a more valuable player than Durant, he's 9 years younger. He's first team All NBA. He's durable. I mean, we love Kevin Durant. I mean, he's an all-time great, but Tatum is an ascending player. Durant's not. So, that's the crux that the Nets and the rest of the league is right now when it comes to Kevin Durant. You're not going to see a trade like with Rudy Gobert where Minnesota sent Utah like 5 spare parts, like 5, guys and the draft picks. Felt like the Herschel Walker trade. Brooklyn is looking for something in return because they don't have their own draft picks.
Yeah,
so they
exactly.
can't tank.
Exactly.
That's what
they have no incentive to
Brooklyn.
lose.
No, it's the same thing in football with the Cleveland Browns. Let's say Deshaun Watson doesn't play this year and they go 4-13. Well, they're not going to be rewarded with that 4-13 season with a high draft choice. That first round pick goes to the Houston Texans. So I guess it's good to be in Houston.
Yeah, I was going to say all the teams in Houston have all the picks.
And we know that the Astros tanked for several years and, on a 5 straight Berkeley Championship Series. So that's the way they're doing things in Houston. Yeah, they love those picks. Maybe Sam Presti should, start another franchise in Houston. He'd fit right in.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what the LA teams do. The Lakers and the Rams just send out picks like crazy. They don't care about them at all. But yeah, it's interesting. And obviously, I think a lot of teams are still kind of waiting to see what happens. And if they keep waiting, they may wait all the way into the regular season because I'm not convinced that anything is imminent by any stretch. And, you're reading about more teams are getting involved in this Durant thing. And the Heat, I read an article today saying the Heat are one of the most determined teams, but the Nets, because of this, we said this in the last show, Sap, because of the structure of Durant's contract, where he's got 4 more years on it, have no incentive to trade him for pennies on the dollar. They don't have to do that. They know he's not going to hold out. Like you said, Sap, he likes basketball too much. He's not going to just not play. And so why would, for somebody who's under contract for 4 years, are you just going to trade just the trade, especially considering, like you also said, they don't have their own picks. So I think the Nets really need to be blown away with something or else they're content to just bring him back.
Yeah, and then you factor in Ben Simmons. And again, that's a wild card if he's healthy, physically and or mentally, and if he's ready to contribute. Look, an engaged, healthy Kevin Durant, an engaged, healthy Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, that's a pretty good starting point, right? I mean, that's a good team. That's a team that can contend in the Eastern Conference without question.
Yeah, and like then the Heat are throwing out like Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson because they can't trade Adebayo to the Nets because of the Ben Simmons thing. That's not interesting to the Nets. Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson for Kevin Durant, that's a terrible deal. That makes no sense whatsoever. So, the Heat are in a difficult situation because of that Ben Simmons trade, and that their best chip to trade would be Adebayo, and they can't move him to that team. So they would need a third team involved in that too. And again, it's just the teams that want Durant are at the rare disadvantage with the Nets being able to say, well, we have this guy under contract for 4 more years, just because he wants to be traded doesn't mean we have to trade him. And like you said, about the guy, his personality. He's not going to just say, well, I'm not going to play for you until you trade me. I don't see that as happening. So it's interesting to see, Sap, and we're still waiting for some dominoes to fall that could, potentially expedite a trade. Like if suddenly you see that DeAndre Ayton, is in talks with the Brooklyn Nets, that means that trade is going to happen. If DeAndre Ayton signs with the Indiana Pacers, which has been talked about for the last couple of days, then suddenly Durant's not going to the Suns. So, we're waiting. I think that's also a big chip that has to fall too, Sap, is what happens with DeAndre Ayton now.
Exactly. Yeah. He may be the first chip to fall. That will give us a better reading on what's going to happen with Durant. And again, I just have the feeling that, especially with Durant, maybe even with Kyrie Irving, we're going to be talking about this all summer long.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. We had that initial sort of flurry of free agent signings in day 1. Day 2, the Celtics made that surprise move of trading for Brogdon, and Gobert gets moved for a huge haul from Utah to Minnesota. And it's really been pretty quiet since then. Mostly because of this Durant and Kyrie Irving thing. But we have gotten some massive contract extensions, Sap. Bradley Beal and Damian Lillard, 2 guys that I think are compared to each other mostly because of their apparent loyalty. They got paid for their loyalty. Bradley Beal signed a supermax contract with the Washington Wizards, 5 years, $251 million, and a very rare no trade clause. So he can use that whenever he likes, and he can stay in Washington as long as he pleases. And Damian Lillard gets a 2-year contract extension worth $122 million. So $61 million a year for Dame Lillard to stay in Portland for 2 more years. Sap, what are your reactions to those 2 mega contract extensions?
Well, I think with Lillard, when that contract expires, 5-6 years down the road, he would have earned $451 million for playing in Portland. And Beal's going to make in excess of $300 million by the time everything is, tied together, if not even more, because they came into the league around the same time. I think Lillard came in a year before Bradley Beal, if I'm not mistaken, or right around the same time. So neither's been able to get to the finals. Lillard's gotten to the conference finals once, where he got swept by Golden State back in 19, and then we saw Washington get to the second round once when the Celtics beat them back in 17. So neither's really had great team success. The numbers look ridiculous, right? And you're looking at it is Washington ever going to contend? Isn't it better that they move on from Bradley Beal, try to get draft picks and start the process over? Same thing in Portland. We know that both of those players are wildly popular with those fan bases. The other thing, too, is we're going to talk about this a little bit later here in the podcast. The TV deal is going to hit in 3 years, 2025, 26. So in 3 years, the national TV deal is going to hit, and it's expected to be 10 years, $75 billion. That's with a B, $75 billion, which comes to $250 million per year per team. So the salary cap is going to just skyrocket. It's going to be up at the NFL level.
Right.
The salary cap is going to be probably close to $200 million. So these $50 and $60 million contracts aren't going to be all that big of a deal in 3 years when the TV contract hits. So remember when players were signing for $14 and $18 million a year, like good, not great players 5-6 years ago, and everyone was like, what the hell's going on in the NBA? Well, within 3 years, those contracts look to be good bargains because of the TV money. The TV money just keeps going up and up and up. So teams are going to have to spend that money. Again, every team in the NBA starting in 3 years will get $250 million a year for 10 years just from national TV. And then you look at the LA Lakers, who their local cable deal is $200 million a year. The Lakers will be making $450 million a year just from TV, let alone local radio,
right? Day one,
ticket sales, everything else. I could run the Lakers, and I'm an idiot. Financially, they're set. Anybody could run the Lakers. You could put Bernie Madoff in charge of the Lakers. You could put Donald Trump in charge of the Lakers with all his bankruptcies, and they would be successful. Before anything is done, here's $450 million. That's essentially what the Lakers will make in 3 years, let alone tickets and jerseys and hot dogs and beer and all that other stuff. The value of these franchises, Jet, approaching and surpassing in many cases NFL franchises. I think there's as many NBA franchises worth over $3.5 billion as there are NFL franchises. That's why they're not selling NBA franchises. I know the Timberwolves went for a couple of billion last year, and that's a low-level franchise. If the Lakers were ever on the open market, it would be $7-8 billion easily. So there's plenty of money. So, again, Lillard and Beal, those contracts won't look that exorbitant 3 or 4 years down the road.
Right. They're saying the entry fee for if they were to do expansion to Seattle and Vegas, which is widely expected, would be like $2.5 billion. That could rise to $3 billion easily, for a team that, doesn't even have any players yet. So yeah, these team values are getting astronomical, as are the TV revenue. But so, yeah, I get what you're saying in terms of the contracts. It makes sense. Teams are looking down the road. And there's always that caveat for a team like Portland and Washington that's not necessarily in the biggest markets. They need to sell tickets. And Damian Lillard we've had this discussion before, arguably the greatest trailblazer of all time. You could talk about Bill Walton. You could talk about Clyde Drexler. I think Damian Lillard's probably the most popular trailblazer player of all time. So he's going to continue to sell tickets and jerseys and all that stuff. And the Washington Wizards, Bradley Beal has quickly become one of their most popular players of all time. And I think also the fact that they've gone on record and saying how loyal they are to those fan bases and those cities endears them to them even more. So it's hard for sometimes these smaller market teams to go through those prolonged tanking periods, especially without, you got to get the go ahead of ownership. And the Thunder are doing it right now. But not every team is okay with doing what Oklahoma City does. And so, I think they're looking at it as they don't mind paying Damian Lillard $60 million a year, Bradley Beal, excess of $50 million a year. because they're going to make it back with ticket sales and all that stuff. They wouldn't otherwise if they were just a team of, rebuilding younger guys who they have to sell to their fan base.
Yeah, I mean, the Lakers had to keep Kobe Bryant. Now, obviously, Kobe's a greater player than Dame Lillard or Bradley Beal would ever think of being. But at the end of his career, many people were like, well, the Lakers should move on from Kobe Bryant, maybe try to get something for him, send him a contender. Because the last 3 years with the Lakers, they averaged 22 wins per season, Kobe's last 3 seasons. But the Lakers were hamstrung because the cable deal they had, the cable company essentially told the Lakers, this deal's null and void if you don't have Kobe Bryant, because he's going to sell subscriptions and he's going to at least have eyeballs on the Lakers. And that's what you have to have. If you're not going to be a contender, at least be relevant with one of the all-time great players. So that's where some of these teams are. So just scale it down a little bit for Portland and Washington with Lillard and Beal. And you see that those teams want to at least be relevant, and especially in the case of Portland, they're pretty much the only game in town, right? They do have a MLS team that does well, but I mean, the Trailblazers, as you know, you went to school in that area, wildly popular there. The Wizards, not so much, because there's other sports in Washington.
Weird football town, weird sports town, I should say.
It's a weird sports town. There's so many transient people,
Exactly.
There's a lot going on there. It's a government city. I mean, their biggest radio station is politics. In fact, the biggest radio station in the country in terms of revenue is a political talk show station in Washington. So they're not into sports like, say, Boston or Philadelphia or New York. It's a little bit different. But nonetheless, Bradley Beal is still that star that they have. So, these contracts, they're only going to go up and up and up. And just look at the value of these players. When Steph Curry was drafted, the Golden State Warriors were worth $400 million. 13 years later and 4 championships later, they're worth close to $5 billion. They've gone up 12 times in value.
That's with a good Steph Curry being the lead guy.
Right. So he's worth the money, right? It's no different than any other player that added so much value to their franchise. LeBron in Cleveland. When LeBron went back to Cleveland for 4 years, the value of that franchise skyrocketed because of him. So to pay these players, it's well worth it. It's an investment. It's no different than the great soccer players, Ronaldo or Messi, the type of contracts that they get. They essentially become partners with you. A famous statement from Joe DiMaggio. I know I'm the old guy here, but Joe DiMaggio was asked about modern players' salaries. And of course, DiMaggio died in 1998, so it's not as if this was current. But he said, they asked him, what would you be asking for if the quality of player you were playing in the modern times? He said, I'd sit down with the owner and go, you have a new partner. And so This is essentially what some of these players are doing now. And look, they're the star of the show.
Absolutely. Sap, you have a column. Is it coming up or is it up right now?
It's coming up. It's coming up. It's all done, ready to post soon.
So it's about, these TV revenues and stuff like that and how astronomical it's getting. But also the NBA is poised to have a new collective bargaining agreement. Nobody's anticipating a lockout or a shutdown or anything like that, as Adam Silver has a really good relationship with the players and the owners alike. But there are things that the league does want to address. And I know you're going to talk about some of those things in your column.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to look at is load management. And look, I'm always in favor of the players. I'll always favor millionaires over billionaires, although LeBron's a billionaire now, so he kind of fits into both. But I always favor the players. But in this situation, I think that it's hurting the league with load management. And look, the teams are just as guilty as the players. The teams will sit players down and make sure that their investments are protected so that those players have long, productive careers. So I understand that this is something that is very, very delicate and it's going to have to be weighed. I'm going to steal one of your ideas where you said that to be first team All-NBA or defensive player of the year or MVP, that you have to play a certain number of games. So let's go with 80%, which would mean 66 games played. So to be eligible for first, second, or third team All-NBA, first team, second team, third team, all defense, or whatever, any awards, you have to play 66 games. And those awards mean a lot to players, right? Especially first team All-NBA. That kicks in a lot more money into a player's contract, so it's worth it for them. So I think you have to kind of look at that and say, okay, to be eligible, you have to play 80% of the schedule, which I don't think is asking all that much at 66 games, because the way I just paint it out is, let's say the Lakers are playing at the Nets on a Thursday night in December, and LeBron is out for load management, as is Kevin Durant. Well, I just laid out $600 for 4 tickets to watch LeBron James and Kevin Durant, and neither is playing. Like if I was going to a U2 concert and spend $300 on a ticket to see Bono and the Boys, and then got there and found out that a tribute band was there instead of Bono and the Boys, I'd be looking for money back. I'd be pissed. So I think that that's something the league's going to have to be very delicate with, but absolutely is going to have to look at. And look, players are going to have to miss games. That's that's certain. But you can't just abuse it to the point where guys are just out all the time. And look, Greg Popovich and the San Antonio Spurs kind of set this thing up over a decade ago, and look, They ended up winning multiple championships. And Kawhi Leonard sat out most of a year, and even when he went to Toronto, missed 22 games, won a championship. Look at Golden State, Jet. We just saw the NBA Finals. Now, some of it was not necessarily load management, but Klay Thompson missed the first few months. He seemed pretty fresh by the finals. Draymond Green missed 6 weeks somewhere in the middle of the season. He played pretty well in the finals, and Steph missed the final 5 weeks of the regular season. He looked really fresh in the finals. So it does work, whereas Jason Tatum has logged more minutes than any player in the league since the pandemic, and he looked exhausted. Not an excuse, but an explanation on the part of Jason Tatum. So I think that that's something that the teams and the players are going to have to deal with, because if you've got a national TV game on TNT, and Durant and LeBron aren't playing, we love Charles Barkley, Shaquille O'Neal, Kenny Smith, and Ernie Johnson, but we want to see the stars on the court, not the stars in the TV studio.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that needs to be tied in. It's something that we've talked about plenty on the show, is that if you tie it into the their contract stuff in terms of awards, because that those have huge incentives, then you're also targeting the biggest problems. Is you don't care about the Grant Williams missing game for load management. You care about Jason Tatum missing a game for load management. Mm-hmm. So it's targeting the correct players too. So yeah, I could see that happening. I think 80% needs to be the baseline, maybe even more. You can't ask, like you said, for 100%. That's unreasonable. But I think 80 is perfectly reasonable. I could even see, like 85, having to play 68 to 70 games. I have no problem with that. So we'll see if they try to do that. I think that's probably the best way to do it. I know that in terms of also affecting the all NBA stuff, is some of the players are unhappy with the way that is voted for amongst the media. Can you see that as something that comes up in the CBA, is how the voting process works for all NBA?
Yeah, that could also come in, Jet, and also the way it's laid out, where I don't know if everyone understands the rules. I mean, some voters say, well, I could vote for Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic first team, even though they both play essentially the same position, because now you can kind of separate forwards or front court from guards. Because it's positionless basketball now. This isn't, 1984 where, okay, it's Magic Johnson, it's George Gervin in the backcourt, the point guard, the shooting guard, and then there's Bird and Dr. J as the two forwards, and Moses Malone at center. And it's pretty much clear cut, right? Like the league is different now. I mean, Chris Paul is, yes, a pure point guard, but is Steph Curry really a point guard? I mean, he's a lead guard, in my opinion. He's not quite a pure point guard. He has a lot of point guard skills, but he scores too much for a pure point guard. You get my point. So I think that's something that you could look at. I thought that first team All NBA, if you were going to have a backcourt, it would have been Luka Doncic and Devin Booker, and then I would have had Giannis, Embiid, and Jokic as the front court. Jason Tatum would have been on my second team, but because you couldn't have both Jokic and Embiid on the first team, it meant that Embiid dropped to the second team and that Jason Tatum was elevated. Again, that will impact contracts.
Absolutely. I think you're right in that it should just be the best 5 players, period. I think for first team, and then second team, the next 5 best players, third team, the next 5 best players. I don't care what position they play. Doesn't matter. Shouldn't matter. Just pick the best 15 guys, and those are the guys who should get rewarded. Why should you get screwed if you're one of the 15 best players and you don't play the right position? It doesn't really make sense. So that's something that I think they should do.
It's not football where, okay, here's the backs and then here's the offensive tackles. I mean, those are completely different positions. We can't possibly compare them. Obviously, the importance of the quarterback is through the roof. But yeah, I think that's something that you have to look at. So load management, try to get the players to play 80% of the games. Like you said, maybe even a little bit more, maybe get it up to 70 games, which would be about 85%. I think that would be something to do. And the other thing I was concerned with is player movement. Look, I love player movement. It makes the league fascinating when players are going all over the place. They're not stuck in the same team. But if a player has 4 years left on a contract, in fact, Kevin Durant's contract is just kicking in now, and then he demands a trade, there's something wrong with that. So maybe you could tax the player 15% of the total value of the contract if he demands a trade. because there's already some kickers in if players get traded before 50% of the contract is up, so we kind of give it both ways to protect the player and the team that, look, if you've got 3 years left on a contract and now we're into getting traded, well, to trade the player, they're going to have to get some extra money on the deal. Or if they demand the trade, they're going to have to give some back so that you just don't have players signing extensions. And then before the extension even kicks in, say, I want out, because player movement's great. It's awesome. And we're seeing it now in the NFL, right? Look at Tom Brady went from the Patriots to Tampa, won a Super Bowl. Matt Stafford goes from Detroit to the Rams, wins a Super Bowl. Russell Wilson, Seattle to Denver, the Broncos are going to contend. That's great. I mean, I have no problem with that. I love that. I wish baseball did more of that to make their offseason more interesting, let alone their regular season more interesting. But I think that that's something that you have to just kind of make sure that players aren't signing these extensions and then because they have a bad day decide, get me out of here. It makes it really difficult to sell the entire sport.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, it's that. And also, after consider the James Harden situation too, less than basically a year after he was traded, he wanted out of there too. You don't want situations like that either, where, even though the contract might say, okay, it's up in a year or something like that. It's just, you want players to have some loyalty. You don't have to have them be, blindly loyal to whatever team they're on, but you have to want them to, because otherwise it's hard to sell fan bases on players. Sure. The NBA at its core is a marketing vehicle for these guys. So it's hard to market a player when he's basically becomes a mercenary and wants out every other year.
Yeah, and then there's Russell Westbrook, who apparently doesn't want out, but keeps getting traded because after 1 year of Russell Westbrook, you don't want to deal with him anymore. If the Lakers move him this offseason, it will be 5 teams in 5 years. I mean, he's turning into like Ricky Henderson or Bobby Bonds, who played on multiple teams. Again, Westbrook's good enough that some teams want him, but he's infuriating enough that the team that has him wants to get rid of him after 1 year.
Right. There's other things that have been, talked about going in the CBA, and some things that are also actively being changed right now. The NBA, I believe their rule committee agreed today to get rid of the take foul, which is, on a fast break. It's not a clear path foul, but it's a foul where you stop a fast break, even though you're in legal guarding position. They're going to penalize that like a clear path foul, one shot in the ball. That's probably good. That's good for the sport. I bet you in the first month of the season, it's going to happen a lot until players adjust to it because they'll forget. That was a good change. And it looks like the Playin Tournament is going to stay. It's been something that has been on a year-to-year basis that they voted on. And now they're just going to make it a permanent part of the NBA schedule, which fans seem to really like it. You and I have talked about this before, Sap. There's a degree of, I like that, it makes the end of the regular season really meaningful, but also there's periods of time where a team should really have no business trying to get into the playoffs versus a team that really has done enough to get into the playoffs. And so one team gets screwed, the other team gets rewarded. So there's complications with it too, but it's going to be a permanent part of the schedule now.
Yeah, the way they set it up, they made it as fair as possible so that, if a team is 10th, they have to win 2 games to get into the playoffs, where if a team is 7th, they have 2 chances to win 1 game. So I think that's pretty fair. It seems to have worked. We really haven't seen a team come from the play-in and make a long run. We kind of thought Brooklyn was that team last year, right? Because they were the 7th seed. They won the play-in, and then they played the Celtics, and Vegas had that pretty much as a pick 'em, and the Celtics swept them, although the 4 games were won by a total of 18 points by the Celtics. If there's anything, a close sweep, it sounds like a Yogi Berra statement, but it kind of was. The games were fairly close, although I thought the Celtics were the better team. But the point being that we haven't seen a team yet make it in the play-in tournament and make this long run. We thought the Lakers were going to do it 2 years ago when they were the 7th seed, won the play-in over Golden State, and then had a 2-1 lead over Phoenix. And I still think if Anthony Davis doesn't get hurt in that series, the Lakers win that series and maybe repeat as champions. But that's another discussion for another day. But I think this is a good move by the NBA. It gives them more dates. It's good for TV. And again, if TV is going to be paying $7.5 billion a year in 3 years, they're going to want more inventory because that's what, makes the bottom line work.
Right. And those games seem to generate a lot of fan interest from outside those markets too, because of the sort of almost NCAA tournament nature of it, that, you can be quickly eliminated. So there's just the ratings would be better than a regular season game because there's outside interest in it because it's unique. So it seems like a no-brainer for the NBA, and they've now, signed that into law, if you will. And so that's going to be a permanent part going forward. And we'll see as these new CBA negotiations approach. If there's other things they look at, we've talked about this before, Sap, too. Adam Silver is still pushing heavily for a mid-season tournament, a la Premier League soccer, European soccer. Doesn't seem to be much fan interest in it, but he seems to really believe in it. We'll see if that becomes a thing. And there's, like you said, there's plenty of other stuff to talk about.
What's always good is that the commissioner, and Adam Silver is by far the best commissioner of the four major sports. I mean, he doesn't have to beat out all that much, but he's very good at his job. He does have a good relationship with the players, the owners, and he kind of pulls everyone together, and he's very progressive thinking. And, he's able to sit down with the top players and work things out. I just don't picture Roger Goodell sitting down with the top players in the NFL and working things out. He essentially, he does work for the owners. He's a slave to them. Whereas I think Adam Silver, who works for the owners in the NBA, but I think he's much better at dealing with the players, and they trust him much more than the NFL players trust Roger Goodell. That's for sure.
Right. And the NHL players, it's gotten better with Gary Bettman over the years, but there's been a lot of, work stoppages and acrimonious behavior. And obviously we saw in baseball with Rob Manfred, there's no trust between the players and him. They hate his guts. He even tried to didn't he give the players like Bluetooth headphones or something at the beginning of the year?
Right.
Which is which, to them is, that's like going to Walgreens and picking up a pack of gum. That means nothing to them.
Mike Trout can't afford those, on his $45 million a year salary. I mean, I'm sure, like, what do you get a guy that's worth that much money a year a gift?
Yeah. So it's like you said, he's not beating out much, but he does have, even if all the other commissioners were really good, he'd still stand out because he does a great job. It's rare for a commissioner to have a great relationship with both sides because, like you said, you are working for the owners, but he does have a really good relationship with the players. In fact, where he made his money was by siding with the players over an owner, and the whole Donald Sterling fiasco. That's where he got all the trust of the players initially, because he was relatively new on the job at that point. Could have gone the other way where he protected the owner. Instead, he listened to the players, and that bought him a lot of goodwill. Not something you could see happening in the NFL or in the MLB.
No, not at all. He's the best in the business.
So, Sap, that's going to do it for us here. We're going to continue to talk all postseason, see what other free agency moves are going to be made, if there's anything else that happens of note in Summer League as that continues on, and keep an eye on the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving situation, see what transpires there.
Absolutely.
So make sure you check out Sap's column that's being posted imminently on Full Press Coverage, and make sure you check his social media at JohnSap25 for updates on that and the show, my social media at Jet Stryer. And we are the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, thanks to Full Press Coverage. And we will be back later with a new pod, so make sure you're here on the lookout for that. And we'll talk to everybody later. Thanks for listening. See ya.